Hello,
Hello. We are philosophizing. My name is Ruby,
and I'm Nathan.
and today we are talking about the
Poison Oak,
science of consciousness and oscillations.
and also Poison Oak.
Oh yeah, okay. So this is I'm throwing my sister under the bus. So I went on vacation this past week and I was in the sun, so I decided to take out some sunscreen and I was like, "Oh shoot, I didn't buy any new sunscreen this year. I'll use some old sunscreen that I had lying around." And I think my sister had left me some sunscreen. For those who don't know this, my sister is a conservational botanist. She spends a lot of time out in the woods, in close proximity to things like poison oak. So I think she might have contaminated the sunscreen or at least the bottle the sunscreen is on because I proceeded to put sunscreen on and all the places that I usually put sunscreen, I had, mild inflammation and very poison oak like response. So I'm like spotted and like itchy everywhere, just like elbow down and like my face and my ears because I put sunscreen on my ears. So
Oh
that has
wow!
been my life
So
for the
your
past.
sister got you Poison Oak sunscreen.
Yeah, and I didn't even like go out into the woods. I was like in New York City,
You're just like, how did I get Poison Oak?
specifically all over my face and my ears. Do not recommend. Sorry for throwing her under the bus. I guess it's kind of my fault too for not purchasing my own sunscreen and just like reusing sunscreen that she had left behind. I
I guess
assume.
I'm curious, like, how do you contaminate the sunscreen without like noticing it? Like, did she not react to Poison Oak?
No, so I think it was on the surface of the bottle, and she does react to poison oak. She just frequently reacts to it enough that she knows how to handle it and
I
knows
see.
what things not to touch again. So like the outside of her clothing, like she'll invert her clothing and then like pack it in her bag, and then she'll throw
I
the whole
see.
thing in the wash. But somehow this bottle of sunscreen like didn't. I think it's the surface actually, and I don't think
Yeah.
it takes that
Like
much
it wasn't
of.
the sunscreen itself. It was like you're touching the bottle and then you're rubbing your skin.
Yeah, I touched the
Um,
bottle and then I put sunscreen in my hands and then rubbed it around and then like proceeded to put it all over myself. So that was great. It was very exciting to have poison oak or ivy on my face. Um, yeah.
it was like,
So
wow, things like you didn't tell me this was poison oak sunscreen.
yeah, didn't know that was a possibility. Um,
Revive
so
says sibling rivalry gone too
I
far.
know. I didn't know if I was allergic to poison ivy or poison oak because I was very good. Like I'm very good at identifying them. So like I've just been good
You've
about.
been good at avoiding them. Yeah.
Yeah. This was like unavoidable. I mean, like I could have also not put sunscreen on. At first I thought I was like, wow, the UV damage was like real. Like my ears are burning. Like I guess the
You're like,
sunscreen wore
wow,
off.
this sunscreen doesn't work at all.
Um, yeah. Anyway,
And
dogs
that
are
dogs are
also a
also
good
good at
carrier of poison
carrying
oak.
poison oak.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I mean, it possibly could be a dog. I might have pet a dog and then like touched my face, I
It's
guess. But
interesting that it got all over your face though, like
yeah,
in
and
a
it's like
sunscreen like
specifically
shadow.
where I
Yeah.
put sunscreen. Like I put sunscreen up to like my neckline because I wear t-shirts, and I was like, yeah, I'll just t-shirts and like t-shirt here, and like above the t-shirt line, nothing. Right? It's just there. And so at first I was like, oh, it must be like some allergen from like I don't know that I don't know about, and I was just anyway, sleuthed it back to do not trust ecologists or dogs ever. Yeah, so I thought that was a light antidote for
Yeah.
today. It's been really rough
Um,
in academia recently. So we're in Boston, so things are going down. The mood is very very low right now. Also very scary because it's like if it could happen to Harvard, it could happen to us.
my parents have gone from being like, "Oh, you should come back and like get a job in California," to being like, "Oh, I found this like cool position in Estonia that you should have." to.
Some of my cohort mates are talking about purchasing a old cruise ship so we can run a science commune off of it and just port to do experiments.
That sounds good. Can I join your
Y-
science commune?
right? And then just
It has a very BioShock vibe to it.
it
But
does, right? It has like
yeah,
I don't
I
know,
mean,
it
I'm
feels
pretty sure
science fiction-y.
that's the exact like reason that the like underwater city exists in BioShock is because they're like the politicians keep meddling with our science. Also very like cyberpunk vibe to it.
A little bit cyberpunk. Like we were literally before we started this stream today, I was on my phone chatting with them and we were like, can we build microscopes on the ocean and like counter the waves? And I was like, John Harrison can solve like pendulum clocks and like circumnavigate the world with, and he solved the longitude problem in the 1700s with like different kinds of wood and like springs and shit. Like we can figure out how do we use
How to make the
microscopes
microscopes work on a
on
ship. Yeah.
yeah, on a
Uh-huh.
ship in 2025? Or maybe this is the retirement plan. Like this is what we
Yeah,
do.
no, it's a good plan. I'll join. Like,
Yeah, and then we
yeah.
can like bop around the world and like port in every city that we have lab friends in, and then just like take them for like a mini sabbatical.
Yeah.
Um,
It's kind of interesting. Like, I feel like the structure of this is like you start a research institution that's like on a ship, so that if the political conditions wherever you're moored like get too bad, you can just like go somewhere else.
pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh,
um, yeah, these are the kinds of dreams scientists are having right now because of the science
like,
climate.
I mean, when you think about it, like Harvard could actually afford to just relocate to a bunch of cruise ships. Like,
That's actually not untrue. They could just buy some islands.
and like we're in Boston, they could like literally just like dock the cruise ships here, like move all their stuff. Like,
Yeah, that's not even like that impossible. Yeah. So for those of you who haven't heard, the U.S. government decided that foreign it's a privilege to have foreign students and foreign researchers at certain universities, and they're just revoking all of it. It's currently I don't exactly know what's happening, but I think a judge is pausing that for now. Um, but like the majority, I want to say more than 50% of the postdocs at MIT, at Harvard, at most universities are not or are like foreign born and are on F and J visas. So you're this effectively will really hit science really hard, like research, very hard. It's very scary. Okay, how many cruise ships does it take to transport a school full of PhDs?
so I think most cruise ships carry about 2,000 passengers, and then they have like a few hundred crew. Um, so I mean, like the space allocation would be a little bit different, but like how many students does Harvard have?
I think. Oh, that's a great question. Just in the graduate school?
Or everyone. 21,000 students, which is 7,000 undergraduates and 14,000 grad students. So about seven cruise ships for the grad students.
Yeah, but that's just to like, you know, be alive. Like we're not like we need like labs.
I mean,
Like
but cruise ships have a lot of like spaces for concerts and recreation and stuff on them too. Like
that's true.
basically you just convert those into lab spaces.
That's true. And I feel like they do conferences on ships. Like
Uh-huh.
this
There's
is
even
not
like semester at sea where people will like go and like take classes on ships at
yeah.
sea. Yeah, like it could work.
Imagine the overhead to pay for a cruise ship lab. It might be the same. It might not be
Yeah,
more
like
expensive,
probably not that much.
especially
Uh,
for retrofitting like an already existing ship. Like we're not building something from scratch. Um Anyway, that's what we are dreaming about on this Friday. Um, but let's talk about our predetermined
our
topic.
actual topic.
Yeah, which is
Yeah, yeah.
neuro oscillations and consciousness.
Yeah, or I think like just broadly like okay, how does so we were thinking we wanted to do a stream about consciousness and we were thinking about like what questions about consciousness do we want to address? And like I think one of the things that we were thinking was really interesting is this question about how does the brain create consciousness? And some recent papers that have suggested that neural oscillations are a really important part of that.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's really difficult to even define consciousness because like different fields will say or will like use different criteria to evaluate consciousness. But I thought a really good way to think about it is to talk about unconsciousness because I feel like there's more consensus, at least scientifically, to like say someone is unconscious. Like, for example, in the context of anesthesia, like you want to be anesthetized properly so that you're disconnected from the outside world so they can like surgically open you up, do things to you, and you don't feel pain, you have no memory of it, and then they patch you back up together and then you wake up and I was like, yeah, it was done. And I feel like during that phase when you're anesthetized, pretty much everyone agrees like you're unconscious during that time.
Mhm. Right.
And same with sleep, like when you're properly asleep, most people agree that when you're asleep, you're not conscious too, right? Like
Actually, there
no?
is substantial disagreement on that.
Oh, okay. So even on the sleep front is because it's arousable, right? It's arousable consciousness.
I mean, actually, it's more because people have like mental experiences during sleep. I mean, like when people are dreaming, for example, like I think most neuroscientists would say that is a form of consciousness
Okay.
generally.
Yeah.
And the
So
interesting thing
difficult to
is,
define.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And the interesting thing is, like, it seems like people, like, pretty much if you wake people up at any point in sleep and you ask them what they were thinking about, they will actually tell you something. So it seems like actually we have a lot more kind of thought that's happening in sleep that we just don't remember.
Ooh. Oh yeah. So not remembering is also, I guess, one of the things that does happen when you're anesthetized too, right? Um, like detachment from like reality, like kind of like the response you get with ketamine. And speaking of, we wanted to talk about this paper that mentioned different different signatures of anesthesia from recording. So one of the things that is conserved amongst all the different kinds of drugs that are canonically used to anesthetize you, like if you go and get surgery done or some procedure done, this will usually happen to you. Like this is no matter which drugs or like some combination of these drugs will increase the low like the amount of low frequency power oscillations in your EGs.
Mhm.
Like if we put an EG on you and they give you most of the different anesthetic drugs that are available or being used today, you would get these signatures. But they also have distinct signatures at the higher frequency level that are distinct to the different types of drugs being used. And so you can kind of tell
Mhm.
um like if they use ketamine to anesthetize you or if they had used propofol or if they've used dexmedetomidine, like different kinds will have at the higher power, at the higher frequencies, they'll have really nice signatures. They're like, oh yeah, this person, they used this drug on them. But at the lower frequency, it basically kind of does the same thing, which is you get an increase of low frequency
Increase
power.
in low frequency oscillations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what's additionally cool in the paper that Nathan's gonna post on the thing is that they see that when they do EGs on humans and also in monkeys while they're putting them under anesthesia, the phase alignment on the left versus the right side of the hemisphere, they start becoming more aligned, and then the different leads on the same hemispheres become more unaligned, like they become more like they don't line up as much
Mhm.
or like less coherent, is that the right word? Like when
So
the waves are like shifted like
yeah, so I thought one of the interesting things, when I can actually pull up this paper and share it, I also just put it in the chat. So I think that one of the interesting things is, so when we're talking about the electrical signals produced by the brain, I think we actually have to differentiate two different things. So one is called phase locking, and that is how how well can you, like, how consistent is the phase between two regions. So if there's always a consistent phase relationship between two brain regions, they'll have high phase locking, even if that means that there's a constant delay. So for example, what that basically means is if you see like a wave like that in one brain region, and then it's always 20 milliseconds later, you see that same wave in another brain region, that then we say that those have a high phase locking value. Um, but the important but what it's really measuring is just how consistent is that lag between regions over time. And so that was one thing they measured here, is how consistent was the relationship. And they found that that went up when they gave anesthesia. The relationship
Yeah.
went up. So that's what's being shown in this graph at the top here. So the gray line is before they gave the anesthesia, the blue line is during, and the scale here is how far apart are you looking in the brain? So how many millimeters apart are you looking? So phase locking value goes up with anesthesia, but there's this other thing that you can look at, which is the phase offset, which is being shown in C. And that is actually measuring how much lag is there between the two regions. And this is what they found. This is where they found this differential effect. So they found that the phase offset increased between kind of neighboring regions in the same hemisphere with anesthesia, and it decreased between hemispheres. So essentially, so there's phase locking and there's the phase offset, and they're kind of different things and they're going in different ways, is the main point.
Yeah. So these are these LFPs? So like local field
Yeah, yeah.
potentials?
Mhm.
So does that essentially mean the neurons close, so they have different leads, like let's say there's two leads in one side of the cortex and two on the other side. So when you say
Mhm.
there's like a phase, um was it phase differential phase, does that mean like when there's a lag, it's
Mhm.
like these neurons, like it was like a wave, like these neurons fired enough for this one to change the potential here, so like it's like a nice peak, and then later on over here it gets that peak later, and it's always the same time apart, like it's
Right,
temporally
exactly. Yeah.
phased. And then the other version of it is just like the power, like how,
Mhm.
like what frequency they are at that matches.
So I would say that so yeah, so they actually that's exactly how they interpret it, and what they think is that um when you apply anesthesia, the brain actually starts to develop more of what we call these traveling waves, which is exactly what you described. It's the idea that the wave starts in one portion of the brain, and basically all the neurons fire, and that excites the neurons next to them, and then so what you get is basically it kind of looks like a ripple moving through water over the surface of the brain. Um, and so I think that the really interesting thing here, I think this is the most interesting thing in this paper actually, is this plot panel C, which is kind of providing evidence for this. So you see when the animal isn't anesthetized in this gray line, the 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 phase lag between two parts of the brain doesn't depend on how far apart they are. And so that suggests that when the animal is awake normally, it's not really a traveling wave. It's like either all there's a bunch of local oscillators that are kind of synced up, or there's some central pacemaker that is kind of driving everything at the same phase. But when you apply the anesthesia, then suddenly it switches to this kind of completely different mode where the lag depends on how far apart are these brain regions, which they interpret as it's switched to being a traveling wave.
Got it. So now, like topographically, distance matters, whereas before
Mhm.
things locally could just be doing their own thing, and the gray line will look like that. So like
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
like near this lead, the neurons here are doing their own thing. Near these leads over here, they're doing their own thing, and they're not correlated in any way. They're just doing they're completely separate. Is
Yeah.
is that
Mhm.
how you get the gray line? Okay, cool. That is not how I
Or so
interpreted
actually, so I would
that.
say actually the way you get the gray line is actually so they show this in one of their other figures. So these are phase plots, which are like a little bit weird to read, but basically what you notice here what they're showing is basically the longer these lines are, the more relationships they found at that phase. And without anesthesia, the most common phase offset is 0 degrees, which basically means that these regions are exactly synchronized. There's no delay when you between the peaks that you see between different regions. And
Oh,
so that's why I say kind of like instead of being a traveling wave when you're awake, it seems like this is more like a system where it's perhaps being driven by some sort of central pattern generator. So there could be some system in the thalamus that is just sending simultaneous inputs everywhere.
got it.
Or
Okay, it's
yeah.
more perfect. It's like super
Mhm.
perfect when you're awake.
Exactly, yeah.
Ah,
And this is really interesting in kind of for theories of consciousness because there's been there's so a lot of theories of consciousness kind of state that consciousness involves like interactions between large parts of the brain. So generally speaking, things that are processed unconsciously tend to involve smaller, more local regions than things that are processed consciously. And we think that this synchronization is important for different brain regions to talk to each other. So the thought is that if two brain regions are kind of oscillating in sync, that means that when the neurons in one region are firing, the neurons in another region are in a kind of excitable, depolarized state where they can receive that input and actually do something with it. Versus if they're out of sync, you might have neurons firing and projecting to one region, but the neurons in that region are super hyperpolarized and are not going to fire whatever you do. In
got
which
it.
case, the
It's not ready to receive.
yeah, so there's this theory in neuroscience that the function of this synchronization is that it kind of helps route signals between parts of the brain. And then if you have two populations of neurons that are in phase, that allows them to talk to each other.
Ah, okay. That's that's okay. Cool. That makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, I I had a question about like this is a philosophical question for you
Yeah.
too. So let's say I
Mhm.
grew cortical neurons. So like on a dish. Like this is I like at what point do you say that it has become conscious? So like if I can make it oh, I can probably make it oscillate like it would if it was under anesthesia by,
Uh-huh.
giving it like an electrical pulse on one side, and you'll get this traveling wave, and then you could probably say pretty confidently like this is an unconscious plate of cells.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So at what point can okay, I'll not anesthetize these cells and let them do their own thing. They're firing doing all kinds of stuff. At what point will you say this dish of cells is now conscious?
Yeah. I
It's
think
like the opposite, right? Like it's like okay,
right.
it's no longer anesthetized. So is it conscious now? If it is the opposite
Right,
of
and
that,
I
it's
think
conscious.
like one of the articles you put in this outline that we have was talking about how kind of you can get oscillatory behaviors from like this from things that aren't brains too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, so I
It's
started saying cells because a couple years
mhm,
ago, this paper came out saying that you can basically grow these cells onto a mesh of like a chip with like electronics, like a matrix, and then you can just give it like electrical signals along this matrix, like like a square, with like different cells, and it can basically play pong. Like it will just
wow.
happily learn to play pong across days. Like you can grow these cells for like months at a time, and then you can like they will increasingly do better and better at pong. So
So it's
clearly,
like a reinforcement learning type of thing.
yeah, like I mean it's not like amazing at it. It'll still fail at pong, but it'll do much better than random, and it'll do much better at random at week 2 than it did at week 1. Like at week 4 it's better than week 2. At week 5 it's better than week 4. So like it improves
Mhm.
at playing pong in a dish.
Right.
um, so like, and then, I hesitate to say it's
It's
conscious,
it is
but
conscious,
yeah,
yeah.
I hesitate to say it's unconscious, but I also say I think this is that in between gray area where it's conscious and not unconscious. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
because
And it,
alternatively, I also posted those another paper where you have like materials that will act really similarly and will have a memory of having fired last time and this pattern hit me. I will do that again next time, and then it essentially you can also make that play Pong and it would do better at Pong after 5 weeks. Do you know what I mean?
right,
Like,
because it has this memory effect where it can
yeah, with
encode.
enough
Yeah.
iterations of that particular
Mhm.
pattern of electrical
Right.
activity, it'll be like next time I'll switch, I'll do that,
And
better.
like for that matter, we could write a computer algorithm or make a computer chip that, if we even wanted to, we could make it using like just like a simulation of neurons or like an artificial neural network that would show the same effect too.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah, and
yeah,
it would improve at playing Pong. Like,
yeah.
we have written artificial neural networks that do better at Pong with every t like, do you know what I mean? We can make
I'm
things that
starting to think that
simulate it.
maybe Pong ability is not like the best test of consciousness.
I know, I agree.
Um,
It's
but
very, um it requires both sensory and motor. Do you know what I mean? Like, it has 2
true. Yeah, yeah.
components. You
No,
gotta
I
give
see
it
what
stuff,
you're
they
saying.
have to
Like,
change, and then they have to, do a thing, and then respond to it. So, like, it has
yeah.
input-output situation
Right.
going.
And I was joking, but like actually like I see your point too. It's like you these Pong playing systems are engaging in motivated behavior and they need to pay attention to some aspects of the situation and not others. And then they need to there's a whole bunch of potential different like responses they can give and they have to select one that best meets the goal. Um and so yeah, so like I think one thing that I was reading about when I was reading about some of these things was talking. So philosophers, I think sometimes will talk about kind of what are the properties of consciousness, and then I think, for example, and I think this is a good way to get at it. So, like one thing that they'll talk about is that consciousness seems to have a limited capacity. So it seems like you can only really be attending to like one or two. You can only be conscious of one or two things at once, for example. Um, and another thing that people talk about is like consciousness seems to have some link to memory and volitionally sustained memory. So you can keep thinking about a thing even if that sensory input isn't present.
That's a good way to think about it, to think about it like energy. Like, it costs energy to maintain consciousness. Like, I
Right.
think
And I think the nice thing about it is it's an objectively testable thing too. So you can have you can have some sort of neural networks and like if you have a neural network that doesn't really have memory, for example. So for example, this Pong playing neural network could in theory only be processing like the state at any given time and it could all be kind of reflexes with no memory and I think based on that we might say it doesn't have these kind of core features of consciousness.
like it needs to be. I feel like this is one of those instances, you know how in psychology the DSM like
Mhm.
defines diseases. I feel like this is one of those cases where they need to go through and just define consciousness so that all of us agree, and then like we can like change, like we just have a like a language that's shared. It's kind of like before we were like, ah, the Turing test. We must
Yeah,
pass the Turing test, and then like it knows it's. Do you know what I mean?
right.
We need that version of that, and I don't know if there is one unified agreement on what it is in neuroscience right now.
I don't think so. I do think we have there's some good consensus on some of the features that consciousness has to have. So for example, like it needs to be able to maintain like you can consciously attend to things and kind of maintain them in memory. It's a limited capacity system. Um, another one that people will bring up is that kind of we have one consciousness. So, for example, consciousness involves binding a whole bunch of information into one percept. And I think we're kind of getting there because I think like the cool thing about these requirements that people have come up is that like they are things that you can objectively measure. Like you can see like is this neural circuit set up to bind a bunch of features together, or is it just a bunch of parallel links between point A and point B? Um,
Does it require the ability to report that it was bound?
so not necessarily. So I think actually a while ago, oh yeah, FFG mentioned something about mentioned there's different parts like P consciousness and A consciousness. And so this is actually an area of research. So typically we say you're consciously aware of if something of a stimulus, if like you can see an image and you can say like, yes, that was a cat. But there's also this idea that you can be consciously aware of something but not be able to report on it. So for example, you can say consciously, hey, something happened. I was aware of an image, but I don't know what it was. And one thing that's talked about sometimes is that maybe you were completely aware that there was a cat there, but then it didn't fully get encoded into your memory by the time you had to report it. So there's this idea that like yes, actually you had full conscious awareness of the stimuli, but for whatever reason you weren't able to report it.
What if it's just attention, like you weren't attending? This is the spotlight theory, right? So like I think this is like whenever change blindness happens, like are you unconscious for the seconds where this, you know, okay, the classic example is like count how many times this basketball is being bounced around between like five different people, and so that you're counting the balls getting bounced. So when the balls are not being bounced, and also during this entire thing, this like gorilla comes to the screen, does a little dance, and then walks off the screen. And the first couple times people see this, they completely miss the gorilla. So if they're only counting the basketball bounces, so they're like only looking for bouncing balls, were they not conscious of when this gorilla was walking through for like all the times the balls was not bouncing? It's like all those seconds in between. Like, can you be? Is it like separable in time? Like, can you be conscious, unconscious, conscious, unconscious for like and flipping back and forth because you're
I
filtering
guess
it
what
all
you're
out?
asking, like, are you conscious of a specific percept or just are you conscious in general?
Yeah, like is there can you just be like conscious in particular within a particular rule, like in the spotlight? Things in the spotlight that you care about, you're conscious. Everything else around it, you're unconscious.
Yeah. I
Is
think
that
that's how
accurate?
that's yeah, I think that's generally how it's thought about actually. And I think so FFG mentioned this distinction between P consciousness and A consciousness. So P consciousness is um just this it's called phenomenological consciousness. It's just there's this sense that there is something subjective that it's like to be like it's just kind of like I have subjective experience right now. That is P consciousness. Like a consciousness is access consciousness, and that's the ability to say like I saw the ball bounce.
Okay.
And and so it's generally thought that you can have access consciousness for some things and not for others, and it really is linked to this idea of attention. So the idea is that if you're not attending to a stimulus, it doesn't become represented in access consciousness.
I come back to a class that I used to TA, and I was chatting with the professor because we were TAing the class, and he said, like, what do you think of the student? And I was just like, I'm not sure if they're paying attention. And he was just like, he was completely unconscious. And I wasn't. And I always thought it was kind of hilarious that he used the word the student was unconscious. And I was like, I mean, he didn't participate in the conversations. He was there physically and he looked awake.
It's like,
Um
yes, a philosophical problem.
I know, and I was out there and I was just like, was he unconscious? He wasn't sleeping, but yeah, I guess he contributed very little to the class. Perhaps he was unconscious. Maybe yeah, perhaps he was a consciousness, like
Yeah.
a
And
unconsciousness.
And I do think that I mean, that is a really complicated thing. It's like, okay, it's like not only like you can be globally conscious or globally unconscious, so like on anesthetics versus not, but then it also seems like we can be conscious of particular stimuli and unconscious of other ones that are happening at the same time. And I
Yeah.
think that's why people talk about consciousness having a limited capacity. And the idea is that it's really linked to attention and the idea, and for some reason, basically, we only have the capacity to be conscious of a few things at
Yeah.
once.
I like to think
Um,
of it kind of like a spectrum of consciousness levels. So I don't know if this is inaccurate, but this is it intuitively makes sense where you have on one end like completely drugged, anesthetized, and then you like on the lower end you're like asleep, and then like just sleepy and and then like in and out during class, kind of paying attention, and then like taking an exam in the do
yeah,
you know what I mean?
yeah.
Or like standing in front of a class giving a presentation, like that's on the other side, and then you were just kind of like on the spectrum at all times and
Right.
somewhere on there.
I think you mentioned in this outline something about like if drugs could make you more conscious than your baseline.
So I was chatting with one of the authors of this paper yesterday, and
Hmm.
he was telling me about, we were talking about reversal agents for anesthesia. So like what would happen,
Hmm.
how you can get out of anesthesia quickly. And he told me that they use like they experimented and they've used it in animals. Um like things like Ritalin. So these are like reuptake inhibitors of dopamine and norepinephrine, and so it would literally stimulate the animals more than it would when they're not on these drugs. So let's say you have an animal that's under anesthesia, and when you take them off anesthesia, it usually takes them like 30 minutes or so to like come back and then start waking and doing its normal things. So if you give them these drugs intravenously, they will come back, they'll come out of anesthesia a lot faster.
Hmm.
And I was like, okay, well, if it's a spectrum and you're kind of like in this middle area where you're like poorly attending and stuff, and then you gave them a Ritalin, then does that make them more conscious? Like, if do you know what I mean? Can we talk about it in that way? And like, and
Right.
all like, are you just more conscious in general if you're on uppers?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because it's like, okay, you give people Ritalin, and like what it does often is it improves your ability for sustained attention, and maybe you also, for example, like remember more stuff because you're attending to it more. And
Yeah,
so like that's interesting to think about, like, okay, so is this experience of could this experience of just having very sharp attention be considered having like more
more
consciousness?
consciousness, right? Like
Yeah.
this is your heightened consciousness state, because the alternative is staying anesthetized in this like half in and out of anesthesia state longer, and that's clearly more on the unconscious side, right? This is kind of
Yeah.
like using unconsciousness to define what consciousness is, and so
Right.
like that's like the flip side of the coin. And I was like, well, yeah, I guess you're more conscious um in that in this particular really defined um like spectrum, if you define it that way.
Yeah.
uh
And it's interesting to think about in kind of the context of like evolutionarily, why does consciousness exist? Like there's like the I think generally the consensus about this is like why did we evolve to have consciousness? And the general consensus is that it is kind of a like just a side effect of our evolving these really complicated systems for attending to certain things while ignoring others and planning our behavior and reflecting on our internal states. So the thought is that kind of like these systems for consciousness, their evolutionary role is really they kind of let you regulate your attention and do adaptive behavior. And so, like, in that framework, it kind of makes sense. It's like, okay, more consciousness equals better attentional function.
yeah, and in theory, then we could spend more time thinking about things and solving problems so we survive, and then it just got
Right.
conserved. with
Mhm.
like with generations of, hey, like if you can like you preserve these bouts of times when you're really productive and can think really well, it's like a useful phase and you're more successful. um I think about that a lot because uh some of the highest consumptions of caffeine are in scientists
Uh-huh.
who I would say are people who try to spend as much time in that, like, I would say, like, golden hours where everything is working, like, you're awake, you're not sleepy, you're thinking, you're being creative, you're reading, you're talking to people, like, that kind of phase,
Like
we're trying.
highly cognitive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
high cognitive phases, like, we try to spend as much of that. We enjoy spending our energy in that kind of space, right? And
Mhm.
and drugs that help with it, like, it's like chicken egg, like, I don't know if we're taking more caffeine to create
Yeah.
that, or if we have that a lot and then, we yeah, the flow state, like, if we want more caffeine because we wanna stay in the flow state longer, um, and we really enjoy it being in the flow state. um Conversely, I had a long chat with my partner while we were driving from my vacation. And he
Mhm.
was and I was like moaning about, the state of science in the world. And he was just like, not everyone could be scientists. And I was like, why? And he was just like, well, if the entire population were full of really hyper curious people, like, y'all are the people that would poke things that will kill you. And he was like, you need a fraction of the population doing this. You need the other fraction of them just to be like doing normal things that are safe and
Yeah.
are not as adventurous, because if you have, this is how you lose a species, because they killed the cat. Their curiosity killed the cat
Or they got
analogy.
killed by the cat. Like
Yeah, or they're like, ooh, interesting, let's climb in this dark hole, and then died.
yeah. I mean,
um and I
I
was just
wanted
like,
to
yeah,
show
you're
you.
right.
There's
You're not wrong.
this XKCD comic that I saw, which I have it up in my office because it is very relatable. So we've got the difference: pull, zap, and the normal person. I guess I should do that. Scientist. I wonder if that happens every time.
Yeah, pretty much. um
um,
Yeah,
but yeah,
this
I
was his
think
argument for why not everyone should be a scientist. And I was
that
like,
makes sense.
okay, fair. He was like, we would die off so fast if we were all scientists.
But yeah, I think there is, I mean, kind of like what we were talking about, like I think like there's different variations of kind of that mentality in different people, but I think the really interesting thing when people talk about the evolution of consciousness is like I think like the way that people think about it is that consciousness is this thing that evolved because we have a lot of stimuli to process in a limited capacity. So the theory is kind of like consciousness is just kind of a outcome of having this system that lets us select what's important about an environment and devote more processing power to that. So actually, one of the most influential models of consciousness is called the global neuronal workspace theory, and it says basically that we become conscious of something that's happening when all these brain regions are sending information about the prefrontal cortex. They're doing some unconscious processing on it, and they're sending it to the PFC. And then the PFC can select things that are important, and then it basically kind of connects the information from all these different regions and then broadcasts it back to those different regions. And the theory being like then that allows it to kind of be reprocessed and we can like kind of utilize all these different neural circuits to process the thing that's important. And what this theory says is when that selection and rebroadcast happens, that is when we become conscious of the thing.
Um, cool.
And so
Oh
it's
wait, go
very
ahead.
tied to this idea of like attentional selection.
No, 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 that's cool. That's a cool idea. I had I was reading this thing about how it could be applied to computing and how much more efficient it was, because I forgot what it's there's this barrier that happens in computing, um where like simultaneous streams of input and output can't be read at the same time. Like the logic
Oh
for the
yeah.
input,
Uh-huh.
there's like a fancy computer science word for like this bottleneck. It doesn't really happen before the age of AI when we use like heavily input like a lot of computing power. But they also calculated the amount of energy that is required to create the same amount of work in and go through this bottleneck. And apparently, like biological systems can simultaneously read both of the input and output, and like the logic in addition to the
Mhm.
inputs. So it could do it all simultaneously just because that's the way biology works.
Mhm.
Um, and because of that, it's way more efficient. Even though you have to like keep cells alive, it actually transfers information in the parallel streams, which you cannot do when in normal computer
In normal
normal
computing,
yeah, and
yeah.
normal like human made computers. Like
Mhm.
it's basically like you give it this thing and it returns a thing. Like you can't give it parallel things like that kind of logic. So like it's not binary in its structure. So it's kind of a cool side effect of it. And because of that, people are looking to, I mean, I talked about the Pong on a sheet on a plate. They built 3D Pong with organoids.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and now there's a bunch of startups that are building computation using these organoids. So they're like growing these organoids, throwing in them, training them to do things, and then like you and actually trying to use it as in or in addition or in parallel with normal computing chips, which is a really cool and I mean it seems really inefficient right now, but it could be really interesting in solving different kinds of problems. Like you can imagine problems where uh if you wanted to have like natural evolution of
Mhm.
ideas this could possibly like accelerate it. I don't know, like it's a really interesting phenomenon, and there's like a bunch of groups working on it right now. uh and I was just sat there, and we were talking about consciousness, and I was like, wait, are these organoids connected to computers that
Are they
are
conscious?
yeah, because they're getting information in and then they're spitting information out, and I was just like, wait, at what point are these mini organoids conscious? Like, and does it count as consciousness if like if you can't measure, if you're not measuring it, is it conscious? If you can
Yeah.
measure it, then is it conscious? Like I was
Yeah.
like, where do we draw the line here when it comes to a bunch of floating cells that are doing the normal patterning things that they like to do just because that's their nature and it's coded in the proteins and things that they express? And when is it, a like a conscious being? It doesn't
Yeah.
matter.
Right. I mean, and I think like, so I had a lot of discussions actually where people were like, Nathan, why are you talking about this? Like, this is such a pointless question. I think it actually does matter a lot. I think like for example, when we talk about animal rights and like, is it okay to cook a lobster by boiling it? Like that hinges critically on like whether the lobster is capable of experiencing conscious pain, right? And like so I think are these are things where there actually are super important, and like if you get them wrong they have really horrific consequences.
Oh, that is so interesting. I was just thinking about this. Like if you decapitate something, their sensory things that go to their head is still intact, right? Like you don't
Mhm.
ever really detach the face from the brain.
Right.
Like you
Uh-huh.
leave that part intact.
Uh-huh.
So do you know what I mean? Like are they still conscious until the cells all
Yeah.
die?
That is actually kind of an open question. I think, like, for some reason, I was reading about this in the context of guillotining humans, um, and like during the French Revolution, and I think there is actually a lot of. It's unclear how long people stay conscious after being guillotined. Um, in theory, it could be very short because the brain is not getting any oxygen, and also, when you chop the head off, the blood pressure to the brain is going to drop a lot. And so that might make you become unconscious very rapidly. But we don't really know. In fact, there's this whole field of like studying near death experiences, which seem to be very weird. And it's, we actually don't really know when brain function, like how long it takes conscious experience to cease after you no longer have like oxygen going to the brain.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what,
Yeah,
I mean, if you decerebrated someone, like you're still like a quadriplegic person is still conscious. Do you know what I mean? Like
right. Uh-huh.
like even if they no longer have motor or sensory information coming in, as
So
long
they
as
decerebrate, you're just saying like you detach all the sensory motor connections.
yeah, let's say you had like a
Mhm.
upper vertebra spinal cord injury. Like these people are still clearly conscious, right? They can still talk to you. They're
Yeah,
still thinking, they can do most things that we're like, yeah, they're conscious. And yet, neck down, um they're not moving, or they're not sensing things. Um that's different. Do you know what I mean? That's is how different is that from, you know, guillotining a person in,
right.
in
Yeah,
the
and I think
French
another
Revolution,
case
right?
another case where I think this sort of thing is super important is there, like kind of the idea of someone being in a coma or a minimally conscious state or something like that. It seems like there are some people where from your behavior they would, you would assume that they're not capable of having consciousness. And what we've seen kind of when we do more advanced neuroimaging on them sometimes is that they actually are able to kind of perceive and respond to questions. For example, you see this sign of essentially salience in the brain called the P300, where you'll say, like, do you want water? And this person who seems to be completely unconscious, if they are thirsty, you'll see basically this burst of neural firing in the brain, for example. And so that's actually a thing that's been talked about ethically a lot of the time, is that it seems like some of these people who seem to be in a coma might actually be capable of being conscious, but it's just very hard to tell because some brain systems are not working. And that can be like the systems for motor expression, but it can also be like neuromodulatory systems. So in some cases, it might be that basically the person has damage to their brainstem and their sleep wake cycle is very dysregulated. And most of the time, they're essentially in deep sleep. But in some cases, they can actually be woken up and become conscious for a bit, for example.
Ah. I was gonna also say that there's variations to how people are affected by anesthesia.
Yeah.
And um and one of the things that is not being, so one of the ways that we are currently monitoring humans are we monitor vital signs, basically like breathing, heart rate, like movement, and like if you like pinch their thumbnail or whatever. So that's how we currently monitor anesthetic state. We are not like across the country. We actually are not using EEGs to monitor brain function, and perhaps that actually should be the way we do things. Like we should be
Some
monitoring brain function during anesthesia, because the same amount of anesthesia to keep someone from having this pain response could be different, really depending. I mean, like redheads need more anesthesia. Like this is
Right.
like a thing that like has happened in past.
And is
So
that linked, like, so are redheads more conscious, or is it something that's more linked to like pain perception, or
we don't actually know exactly, but they some people think that the gene for that causes red hair, the MC1R gene or whatever, um, is is also associated with lower pain tolerance, and so they're
Mhm.
feeling more pain. So
Oh, huh.
they'd need more, but actually we don't exactly know why. Like it is not super well known. Like that's super fast. I mean, it's super fascinating. But on the other hand, for all the redheaded people out there, we should be EEGing them. Like just make
Yeah,
them,
yeah.
give them a head cap and make sure they're like actually really under. And there's lots of these waves of oscillations that are happening when we think they're under before you cut them open to do procedures.
Interestingly, there is a EEG anesthetic depth monitoring thing that's used. It's called bispectral index, and it's this kind of proprietary algorithm. I think it's not used as like the primary way that people do it, but I think it has been getting some increased use.
Yeah. Oh, this is the thing where they just score you. They'll just like here's like a number of how under anesthesia
Of
you
how
are.
conscious you are, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of, I mean, it's, I feel like it's very useful because you can just like tell like, hey, they're a 4.
Uh-huh.
they they are they're awake.
Mhm.
And like,
And
was it
it's
not?
picking up on like this stuff that you mentioned before, like for example, like all anesthetics increase the amount of slow waves in the brain, for
Yeah.
example.
Um yeah, this should be a thing. It should be, you know, general practice. It's just it's slow to adopt because heart monitors, they already exist. Monitors, they already exist in most hospitals, and they're like, well, you want us to add a thing that costs money, and then now you need to teach people to read it too.
Yeah.
I think it would give better results in general, and it's good for science, good for medicine and practice. That is probably not pretty tight.
I see why people are skeptical too. Like I guess
Yeah.
like even if you have the BIS monitor, I see why the anesthesiologist wants to be like, oh, also let me just poke him just to make sure. Like
Yeah, and then they're like, "Well, if you're already poking them to make sure they're, like, out, then, like, why go through this whole trouble?" You know what I mean? Like, then you're like, "Okay, well."
yeah, then why?
They're like,
Yeah.
"It's already working." But, you know, I think it's safer. You'll, like, some people probably don't need to be as deep as we are putting them under, and then it takes a lot longer to get them out. That's why, like, they're testing all these drugs to get them
To help
out of
people
the
come
state.
out of
Yeah, because,
anesthesia.
like,
Yeah.
you know, being anesthetized is really dangerous, especially for people who are older and have, like, other complications. So, like, it's better to be lightly anesthetized if possible and then, like, easy out. Just safer. You don't wanna, you know, people to stay unconscious forever, so, you know, it's a useful tool,
Mhm.
and we can do it. It's just work, and it requires, I guess, more anesthesiologists to learn more things.
It's interesting. There's actually I talked to some people a while ago where they were actually interested in could you stimulate certain patterns of brain oscillations just directly to help people come out of anesthesia faster? And interestingly, they found some evidence that generating this particular like kind of sleep oscillate or this particular kind of oscillation that's found in sleep called a sleep spindle, you can kind of provoke the brain to make them with specially patterned sounds. And they found that when you did this, people recovered from anesthesia faster. And I think that's super interesting because it kind of tells you something about it suggests that these oscillation patterns might actually have a causal role, which is kind of wild.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. It's not just like a side effect
Right.
of like the normal brain activity. It's actually doing the thing.
Yeah.
That, I mean,
Interestingly,
that's an age-old question, right? Like, is the
yeah,
oscillation the side effect of neurons doing their thing, or is it the actual thing? Like, that's what
yeah.
matters.
And I do think with consciousness, the strongest evidence for it, I think, is that it's a marker of just kind of like what is the brain's network structure like right now. There was actually this in other paper that I found really cool, which was it was kind of touching on some of these things you were talking about, like what happens if you perturb the networks in different ways, which is they did TMS when people were conscious and then in different states of unconsciousness. And
Mhm.
what they found was that when people are conscious, you kind of give this electrical stimulation to the brain, and it triggers this really complicated response in different brain regions. Versus if they're unconscious, it tends to be kind of like this, where it's just like you get this very simple response that dissipates very quickly, or alternatively, you just kind of get this very like the brain kind of acts very homogeneously and just kind of you get a very distributed response, but with very little variation between brain regions.
Oh, that's cool.
And
Huh.
so kind of what they argue in this is that the consciousness in the brain is really a thing that happens when you have these really complex networks, like large complex networks are required for consciousness. And then probably some of these oscillatory things that we see are kind of reflecting the network structure of the brain.
Do you think there's like an optimal number where you can hit to get consciousness? So like obviously like 2 cells, like you're probably not going to be like, oh, that's
Yeah.
conscious. But like 100 cells, or like is 100 cells enough? Like is 1,000 cells enough? Like how many order? Do you know what I mean? Like you can just move up 100,000, 100,000. Like, do you think?
Like how many cells do you need to be conscious?
Yeah, how
Or
many cells, how many number of cells do you need to get to reach a state where this kind of like you'll see this kind of perturbed like if you perturbed it you would get this these kinds of patterns you see here.
yeah. I
And
think
like doesn't matter how many number of cells.
yeah. I mean, I think like you could get complex patterns like this with, I mean, we know you see something like this in like C. elegans, right? And that has
Mm.
like 302 neurons. So between 0 and 302.
At 302, we're calling it like, yep, it's
But
conscious
like,
now.
yeah, but I will say like, okay, I think like the changes in oscillations, like the reason we see oscillation patterns that are associated with consciousness, I think is because there's brain connectivity patterns that are associated with consciousness. But I don't think it's just like having any complex pattern of connectivity like
Mm.
somehow makes you conscious. I think that these complex patterns are reflecting more specific processes that are happening in the brain too. And I think one thing that like actually recently kind of everyone has come to an agreement on is that for consciousness to happen, you need to have kind of recurrent feedback and possibly amplification. So consciousness seems to particularly involve, like, for example, the visual cortex sends signals out. Those signals either kind of reverberate in the visual cortex. So either like there's local populations in the visual cortex where some neurons project onto other neurons, then they project back, or it projects to some other place and the information comes back. That kind of what they call recurrent processing seems to be really important for consciousness. And it seems like that enables some of this amplification and kind of selecting the parts that we're going to pay attention to. And
Mm.
so you can think about like, okay, if recurrent processing is really important, that probably requires a complex network like this because you have to have your systems that are originally representing the information and then something that they send it to, and then it needs to come back. So you kind of have to have these weird looking waves if you're going to have recurrent processing.
Got it.
Um, I think, and similarly, I think that might explain something about like, okay, why are these oscillations so important? Why are these kind of sinusoidal looking oscillations important for consciousness? As they could be reflecting kind of the timing of this recurrent processing.
Got it. Huh. Anyway, that that's so much to think about.
Yep.
Also, we have ran out of time. Thank you for joining us. This was philosophizing and consciousness. We'll come back next week with a different topic.
With something. Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye.